This move opens lines for the queen and king's bishop while staking a claim in the center, preparing for rapid development and potential pawn breaks. This move directly challenges white's central pawn, leading to classical openings where both sides aim for rapid development and control of key squares. This move, knight to f3, is a fundamental and aggressive response, directly challenging black's central pawn and preparing to castle kingside, aiming to control key central squares and develop a piece actively. This move, developing the knight to a natural square, reinforces the central pawn and prepares to castle, adhering to sound opening principles by actively contesting central control. This move initiates the Raul Lopez, a classical opening that immediately challenges black's knight and prepares to exert pressure on the d4 square. This move, a6, initiates the Morphy defense within the Raul Lopez, a classical opening where black challenges white's bishop and forces an immediate decision about its placement, influencing future pawn breaks and piece activity. Retreating the bishop to a4 maintains pressure on the e5 pawn while preparing for castling and developing the kingside. This move initiates the Berlin defense, a robust and popular response in the Raul Lopez, challenging white's bishop and preparing to counterattack in the center. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks for future central action. This move logically develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to castle and centralizing a key piece. Re1 prepares to centralize the rook and support the e4 pawn, commonly seen in the Raul Lopez to facilitate a potential pawn break with d4. This move consolidates black's pawn structure in the center and prepares to develop the bishop, reinforcing the pawn on e5 and creating a more solid defensive formation within the Raul Lopez opening. This move prepares to expand the pawn center with d4, aiming to gain space and control of the central squares in this variation of the Raul Lopez. Castling kingside secures the monarch and prepares for potential central pawn breaks and piece development. This move aggressively challenges the center, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This pawn move contests the center and gains queenside space, a common theme in many lines of the Raul Lopez, forcing white's bishop to make another decision about its square. This move repositions the bishop to a safer square, preparing to support the center and potentially target black's kingside if the pawn structure opens. This developing move in the Raul Lopez, the open Spanish variation, challenges white's knight, aiming to break the coordination of white's pieces and potentially gain a tempo if the knight retreats. This move solidifies white's central pawn structure, gaining space and restricting black's pieces while preparing for potential pawn breaks later in the game. This strategic retreat of the knight to b8 prepares to reposition it to d7, supporting the pawn on c6 and potentially reinforcing the kingside after black's pawn advances on the queenside. This move addresses the bishop on g4, which was pinning the knight on f3, and also prepares to challenge the central pawn tension by potentially playing g4. This retreat allows black to maintain the bishop's placement on an active diagonal, forcing white to decide whether to capture and potentially weaken their pawn structure or allow the bishop to remain a long-term strategic threat. This move begins repositioning the knight to a more active square, preparing to support a kingside initiative or potentially join an attack on the queenside after developing its counterpart. This move redeploys the knight from its vulnerable b8 square, aiming to support a future c5 break and prepare for the bishop's retreat if necessary. Typical of Raul Lopez closed variations. This knight repositioning to f1 initiates a typical Ruy Lopez maneuver, aiming to reroute the knight to g3 to increase pressure on black's kingside and potentially support a future e5 pawn push. This move strategically repositions the rook to the e-file, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn advances or exchanges in the center while also defending against any immediate threats along the open file. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's kingside, aiming to dislodge the pinned knight and gain space by forcing a pawn exchange or retreat. This move reiterates black's intention to keep the bishop active and support the center, but it also invites further pawn aggression from white on the kingside. This knight maneuver repositions the knight to a more active square, supporting the g4 pawn and preparing for a potential kingside attack, while also freeing up the f1 square for other pieces. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and potentially challenge white's advanced kingside pawns, addressing the space disadvantage created by white's aggressive pawn push. This move initiates a pawn break on the queenside, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares on black's kingside and potentially open lines for white's rooks and bishop. This knight retreat prepares to reposition to a more active square, potentially f8 and then g6, to contest the dark squared bishop's control and reinforce the kingside. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to support a potential kingside pawn storm and also eyeing lines that could open up on the queenside after black's pawn advances. This move challenges white's control of the queenside and prepares to support a potential, circa 5, pawn break, aiming to destabilize white's central pawn structure. This capture opens the a-file for white's rook, creating immediate attacking potential against black's queenside pawn structure and potentially restricting the mobility of black's pieces. This pawn recapture is necessary to regain material equality, opening the a-file for potential counterplay against white's queenside. This pawn sacrifice on b4 aims to open lines on the queenside, challenging black's pawn chain and potentially creating attacking chances. This move shifts the queen to the queenside, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially support a c5 pawn break to challenge white's central pawn structure. The move bd3 aims to activate the bishop, support the central pawn push d5 by potentially challenging black's nf6, and prepare for future central play or kingside action by clearing the way for a potential move of the queen. This move breaks open the c-file, initiating a thematic pawn struggle in this Ruy Lopez variation where black aims to challenge white's queenside space advantage and create counterplay. This pawn capture opens the d-file, creating tactical possibilities and potentially liberating white's pieces for active play in the center. This move recaptures the pawn, centralizing the queen and preparing to contest the open c-file, which is a vital positional consideration in this Ruy Lopez martial attack variation. The rook aggressively moves to the 5th rank, aiming to control the open file and potentially penetrate black's queenside position, forcing a response from the opponent. Black has captured the pawn on c3, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially gain tactical counterplay. But this move opens the c-file for white's rook and might prove to be a dangerous distraction if black doesn't secure the initiative. By capturing the pawn on b5, white initiates a decisive exchange that opens lines and increases pressure on black's weakened queenside pawns. This move is a necessary repositioning to defend the undefended c7 square from white's aggressive rook and bishop battery. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially support white's central pawn. Push. The move red 8 repositions the rook to an open file and supports the c7 square, preparing to contest control of the d file and pressure white's queenside. rc1 is a strong move that contests the c file, aiming to disrupt black's queen and potentially exploit the open file for further pressure, especially with the rooks now more actively placed. This move seeks to defend the b7 pawn and reposition the queen to a more active square, while preparing to contest the open c file or potentially transfer to the kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the c6-f3 diagonal and potentially support advances on the kingside while forcing black to address the threat. Black recaptures the pawn, but it opens the door for white's rook to become active on the 7th rank and potentially target the king. This move repositions the rook to a more active square on the 4th rank, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially support an advance along the a file. This move brings the queen back to a more active square, seeking counterplay by threatening the knight on f3 and potentially targeting the white king or weakening the pawn structure. This move prepares to utilize the newly opened a file and the diagonal b4 h8 to put pressure on black's queenside and potentially isolate the weak pawn on b5. This knight retreat to f8 aims to unblock the e-file for the rook and prepare to redeploy to e6 or g6, potentially challenging white's active pieces. This repositioning of the knight to d2 aims to support the queen's advance and potentially challenge black's queenside pawn structure while preparing for future central expansion. Black's queen returns to the central part of the board, aiming to exploit the open c file and potentially pressure white's pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, preparing to contest the d file and support potential advances on the kingside or queenside. This move, bg5, repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to pressure white's queenside and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure if white is forced to defend the attacked pawns. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to increase pressure on black's queenside pawns and potentially prepare for a future exchange sacrifice. This exchange simplifies the position by removing a key defender of white's queenside, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This move wins the exchange by sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns and eliminating black's dangerous attacking piece on b7. This move exchanges a bishop for a knight, aiming to simplify the position after white's aggressive pawn push on the kingside and potentially exploit the open c file, though it also surrenders the bishop pair. This rook exchange resolves the immediate pressure on the a7 pawn and aims to simplify into an endgame where white hopes to leverage their superior pawn structure and active pieces. This move reclaims a piece, simplifying the material balance and aiming to exploit the open d file and the potential for queenside pressure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, challenging black's central control and preparing for potential pawn breaks or threats against the king. This move prepares to recapture the bishop on d5 with the knight, reinforcing the central defense and potentially creating counterplay by developing the knight to a more active square. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, likely f4 or g3, to support the central pawn structure and contest control of key squares. This knight maneuver aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially f6 or e5, to participate in the central struggle and potentially attack white's d5 pawn. White's queen aggressively occupies the queenside, creating immediate pressure on black's vulnerable pawn structure and eyeing potential tactical shots. The bishop retreats to b8, aiming to safeguard the queenside from potential threats and prepare for future pawn advances on that wing. The queen repositions to a more active square, aiming to control the central dark squares and support potential advances on the kingside, while keeping an eye on the weak points created by black's scattered pieces. The knight's redeployment to c5 aims to contest the crucial light squares and pressure white's queenside structure after white's awkward piece placement. This move aims to reinforce the kingside pawn structure, preventing black's knight from gaining access to f4 or g5 and preparing a potential kingside pawn advance to gain space. This move begins the king's essential journey towards safety, as the queenside has been dramatically weakened and the center is still contested, requiring the king to find a more secure position. This move activates the knight to a central square, aiming to control important squares and potentially support pawn advances or prepare for tactical operations. The black king needs to find safety on the queenside to avoid white's persistent pressure along the a-file and central knight activity. This move repositions the knight to a very active central outpost, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create new tactical opportunities. The king moves to a more central square, potentially preparing to support the knight's advance or to participate in the endgame. This knight maneuver aims to control key central squares, particularly d4 and e5, while preparing to support a potential kingside pawn push or redeploy to a more active outpost, potentially on c7. This move attempts to challenge white's strong centralized knight and prepare for potential counterplay along the c-file. This move aims to gain space on the kingside and potentially create attacking opportunities by opening lines or forcing weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This move aims to activate the bishop and potentially support an advance of the f-pawn to control the d5 square, while also defending against tactics involving the knight on c3. This aggressive pawn thrust breaks open lines and challenges black's control of the kingside, aiming to exploit the open diagonals for white's rooks and queen. This move is a tactical blunder, allowing white to win material by recapturing the bishop with the knight and exploiting the open c-file. This pawn sacrifice aims to expose the black king by opening the g-file, potentially leading to mating attacks after the king is forced to capture. This move initiates a critical exchange, accepting white's pawn sacrifice and opening lines for counterplay, though it also weakens the dark squares around the king. This sacrifice is a desperate attempt to break through black's reinforced pawn structure and open lines towards the black king, exploiting the exposed king position created by the prior pawn advance. This move is a desperate attempt to regain material and complicate the position, but it overlooks the tactical sequence leading to the loss of the knight and a severely weakened king. This aggressive pawn sacrifice, fxg5+, opens the king's position for attack and is supported by the knight's mobility to exploit the weakened structure after the capture. This capture is forced by white's discovered attack on the king, forcing black to recapture and entering a king and pawn endgame where white has a material advantage. This move resolves the pin on the knight by attacking the attacking bishop, aiming to simplify the position after the exchange and consolidate the material advantage. The knight capture on e4 is a critical decision, as it opens up the f3 square for white's knight and creates a complex tactical battle in the center, with immediate consequences for both sides' kings. This move capitalizes on the exposed black king, forcing the immediate loss of material or a severe positional disadvantage for black. This move is a desperate check that forces white to address the immediate threat to their king. As the black bishop is now on a critical diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety. Kilogram 2 is a logical retreat, bringing the king to a safer square on the diagonal, away from potential checks and centralizing it for the endgame. This move aims to complicate the position by offering a pawn exchange, hoping to create tactical imbalances and exploit white's potentially exposed king once the material is reduced. This move forces black's king to a more exposed position, creating opportunities for further mating attacks. The move seeks to improve the king's safety by moving it away from the immediate danger zone of the connected passed pawns and the attacking queen, while also preparing to potentially support the pawn push in the center if white's king remains passive. This king hunt utilizes the open lines created by recent exchanges and pawn advancements to force checkmate by exploiting the exposed black king. This move desperately tries to escape the mating net by bringing the king closer to potential pawn support, but it ultimately fails to address the impending checkmate on h8. This exchange simplifies the material, leading to a drawn endgame where white's king is too exposed to defend the passed pawn effectively against black's active king and rook. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to contest control and potentially create mating threats on the kingside or support a pawn advance. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on g3, preparing to potentially swing to f5 or h5 to increase pressure on black's king or support a pawn push. The black king, after a long journey, seeks safety on f6, attempting to regroup and connect its remaining pieces while preparing for potential pawn advances or exchanges in the endgame. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, directly attacking the c-file and potentially preparing to support a pawn advance or consolidate pressure on the queenside. 54. bc5 aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square, potentially targeting the weak f2 pawn and preparing to contest the open c-file if white advances their king further. This knight check is a decisive move, forcing the black king into a precarious position and preparing to exploit the weak pawn structure that has developed on the kingside. The knight's retreat to e7 is a necessary defensive maneuver to avoid being captured and allows the king to reposition to a safer square on the subsequent move, potentially in preparation for defending the c5 pawn. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing it for potential pawn promotion races or defensive duties while also supporting the knight. This move seeks to centralize the king and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. After the queens are exchanged, the king is actively participating in the endgame, centralizing to support the pawn advance and control key squares. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, defending the pawn on c6 while preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file. The check forces black's king to move, and white plans to exploit the vulnerable diagonal with the queen and knight to regain material advantage. The move secures the king and prepares to counterattack the active white queen and bishop on the queenside. This move activates the knight to its most active square, preparing to fork the king and rook if it moves to g7, and supporting a potential kingside attack. This move intends to reposition the rook to a more active file, potentially defending the king or supporting a pawn advance, while white's knight remains centralized and threatening. This move forces the black king into a more vulnerable position, potentially setting up a mating net or winning material by exploiting the king's current lack of shelter. This move seeks to reposition the king to a safer square, avoiding the immediate threats and potentially preparing to defend the weakened dark squares on the king side. nd5 establishes a strong knight outpost, threatening the c7 pawn and preventing the black king from finding safety on the queen side. The defender attempts to consolidate their position by reinforcing the pawn on c7 and preparing to defend against the advancing white knight and the threat to the king. This is a decisive check that forces the opponent's king to move to a less protected square, allowing white to transition to a winning endgame with superior piece activity. This move seeks to escape the checking attack along the b-file and find a more secure square for the king to regroup, aiming to consolidate defensive positions against white's aggressive piece play. This move centralizes the knight, preparing to support the pawn push and potentially coordinate with the king for endgame activity, while also guarding against black's active knight,